Thank you. Thank you very much, Ken. I can still remember him coming down from Columbia University up there at Park Avenue, and after the interview with me, he was going down the hall, and I did say, check this guy out. I think we've got a Rockefeller spy here. And the Rockefeller spy went on to be a strategist for the greatest political mind of the 20th century, Richard Nixon, and a speechwriter for one of the greatest communicators of all time, Ronald Reagan. You know, I've just been on a tour of the library now that Frank Gannon and others, and Dwight Chapin and others, and Bill have really fixed it up, and that was the first time I've seen it. And I will say for the folks, and there are folks out here on the C-SPAN audience, and of course everyone here, having worked with the old man for 8.5 years, Shelley worked even longer with him, that you can't watch that film without having your heart really torn at. It is magnificent. I barely got through it. But you ought to see it. Let me talk now about the Nixon and what was in the book, the Nixon's White House Wars, the battles it made and broke a president and changed America, or basically divided America forever. Ken has listed some of the what was going on back in the 60s, so let me begin around 1968, the year before Richard Nixon took office. We took off for January 31st for New Hampshire, 1968. Romney had been in the race for a couple of months, not doing well. We flew up to New Hampshire, and I remember Teddy White asking me about the Tet Offensive, which had just occurred. I had a brother in Vietnam at the time. And that, of course, cost 1,000 American lives, and many weeks before they got back to Capitol at Way. That was the first event, and Walter Cronkite came home and said, the war is basically lost. We went into New Hampshire. We ran a tremendous opening month campaign, intense when the president was there, and then we go back to Florida to make sure he was arrested, come back and went after Governor Romney pretty hard, because at the end of February, Governor Romney dropped out of the race, and Richard Nixon was alone. And that was followed then by Nelson Rockefeller, who was supposed to get in. He got out of the race. And then began what we called Crazy March. Gene McCarthy won 42% of the vote against LBJ. People don't remember, LBJ was a write-in. He didn't even have his name on the ballot. I don't know what political intellect thought that up. Anyhow, but McCarthy got 42 to LBJ's 49. And then right after that happened, we won, of course, a landslide. Right after that happened, Bobby Kennedy in the Senate, went to the Senate, same Senate room where Jack Kennedy declared for president, declared for the nomination on around March 17th, a few days after New Hampshire. And then Richard Nixon had me at the end of March, had me waiting at an airport in LaGuardia to report on him on what Lyndon Johnson said on his speech on Vietnam, because we had canceled our speech. I'm waiting in that limousine, and I'm listening to LBJ, and that's when he announced he wasn't going to run again. And he's out of the race all of a sudden. 4 days later, Dr. King was shot to death in Memphis. There were riots in 100 cities. My hometown, Washington, D.C. I got calls from friends. 7th Street was burning up. 14th Street was burning up. Federal troops in the nation's capital, Marines on the steps of the Capitol itself. This is what was going on in that spring. Then came Oregon. President Nixon won 6 straight states. No one would contest him and get in against him. My main fear was a fellow in California named Reagan, because as long as we had the Goldwater conservatives with us and the Nixon Republicans, no one on the left, Rockefeller, Romney, I believe, could beat us. So Reagan didn't get in, except late in Oregon for about a month or so. He had a film up there, but he only got 22% of the vote. Nixon got 70% of the vote. So Shelley and I were at the Benson Hotel that night. It was May 28th. And I waited at the hotel. We went down. The old man was having dinner, celebrating because we won big and we won early. But the interesting thing that night was the first time a Kennedy had been beaten in any political race since World War II. And Bobby Kennedy was coming up from California. Shelley and I went down to the front of the Benson Hotel to watch him come in. He had the dog with him, and he came in. I went down to a room, it was like this, and watched him give a beautiful concession speech to Senator McCarthy and say, "We're going on to California." 1 week later, I was back in New York when an aide of mine, Jeff Bell, called me from the headquarters and said, "Bobby Kennedy's been shot." And so I called the president, who had been, Mr. Nixon, who had been awakened already by Julie and already told about it. Then I asked the president that same year if I might, because I thought, a former journalist, I thought it might be interesting if I went to the Democratic Convention. Thought it'd be fairly exciting, more so than ours, since we had a walk in ours. And so I went out there, and I happened to have a suite up on the 19th floor of what we call the Comrade Hilton Hotel. And I'd gone down in the street and went across the street, and I was born and raised, Catholic Jesuit school, so I was in a coat and tie and everything down there in Grant Park. And everybody, it seemed, they always would point at me and yell, "FBI, FBI." And they yelled a lot of other things as well. So I was up on the 19th floor watching what was the scene in the park where they were raising Cain, and who walks in but Norman Mailer with the light heavyweight champion Jose Torres, and I was alone there. And we heard a racket down in front of us, and so we looked out, and this phalanx of police came down Balbo, turned to the right, Grant Park's right across, it's Michigan Avenue, and they headed into that park and wailed on these folks for 15 minutes, and the Jose Torres was cursing the police. I remained silent because I was rooting for the police after what those fellows had been doing to me. But there we saw the Democratic Party come apart right there in the streets of Chicago, an historic event. And I did feel sorry for Hubert Humphrey coming out of there. The phrase "dump the hump" remained constant, attacking him. For the first 5 weeks, he couldn't get any speeches done without having disrupted. And then sure enough, he gave his Salt Lake City speech, and he started moving, and I think Larry Higby can probably remember that. Started moving. It was 43 for Nixon at the beginning of October, 28 Humphrey. Wallace was 21, 7 points behind Humphrey. By the end of October, it was 43-43 all. We had lost 15 points. People don't recall Hubert Humphrey had a phenomenal comeback in the month of October 1968. So then we are in the White House. We arrive at the White House, and America was coming apart after 1968. We had 31,000 dead Americans in Vietnam when President Nixon took office. No end or victory in sight. The president was the first president since Zachary Taylor in 1848 to take office without either house of Congress behind him. He had a hostile press corps. Supreme Court was led by Earl Warren, not exactly Mr. Nixon's friend from California days. And the bureaucracy had been built up in the New Deal and Great Society, so it was replete with hostiles there. That's the nation Mr. Nixon inherited. But if you take a look back at the president's inaugural in '69, it is immensely conciliatory. In other words, he held out his hand to foreign powers, the Soviets and others at home. He said, let's listen to each other, let's hear each other, and let's stop shouting at each other. And I think that's what he wanted to do. In his whole first 9 months, I think were sort of positive. He kept a lot of the Great Society, which I didn't agree with. He went on a very successful early tour to Europe, the European capitals. Apollo 11, the first launch of astronauts into space, came in the middle of July. I was down at Canaveral with him and watched that go off. And all I can remember is Ray Price saying, we were about 3 miles away. Ray Price, my fellow speechwriter, it was just magnificent, this gigantic rocket, as I say, 3 miles away, but very visible. And I remember Ray Price saying, the noise alone was worth the $23 billion when that thing rose off. So the president went out to Guam then and welcomed the astronauts. And he gave a speech in Guam, and he talked about a new foreign policy where we help our friends themselves. I think it was a speech, I think, really far, far ahead of its time, and frankly, right, as far as I'm concerned, right on the money. Then came October, and all of a sudden these massive demonstrations were forming up. It was a calm before the storm when the president had that successful summer, his first one in Clemente. And I know David Broder, who was a leading liberal columnist of the day for the Washington Post, he wrote on 8th of October, he said, "We are about to see the breaking of the president. It is becoming more obvious with every passing day that the men and the movement that broke Lyndon Johnson's authority in 1968 are out to break Richard Nixon in 1969. The likelihood is great that they will succeed again." At that point, looking at the demonstrations, I wrote the president, I think, a significant memo, one of many that are in the book. And we were been asked, I think, by Haldeman for name the 8 successes we've had during this year or something. And I wrote the president back saying, you know, this is like asking Louis the 16th about the 8 successes he had in 1788. We're in the eye of a hurricane. And it was said, sir, of Louis the 16th that he would have been a great king, but he inherited a revolution. And it was about a day or two later, Bob Haldeman called me that day and said, "When do you think the president should make the speech?" And I said, "We got 2 massive demonstrations coming up, the biggest in history in Washington. We don't want to be, in effect, spooked by these things, and so do it midway between the two." And sure enough, the president picked November 3rd between the October 15th demonstration and the one coming on November 15th to make his great silent majority speech. Now, let me say that, and there's a lot of people who have claimed sort of credit for that, but entire credit for that speech belongs to Richard Milhouse Nixon. As far as I know, no speechwriter. I surely did not. I've looked in my files to find out if didn't I contribute something to that speech or write something for that speech. The President of the United States wrote that himself. He stood up in the teeth of this storm. He realized his presidency was in real danger of being broken by Johnson's, and he delivered it, and he called on the great silent majority to stand behind him for peace with honor in Vietnam. And they did. The response was phenomenal. In something like 70% of the American people supported the policy, even the Congress, 300 members of Congress, members of the House of Representatives or members of Congress endorsed the president's speech. And it was, I think, the real making of the president. But about that night something happened, something else happened. After the speech was over, the 3 networks trashed it. The anchors trashed it. They inherited an instant analysis. They trashed it. One of them brought on Averell Harriman, who had failed miserably in Paris, and he trashed what the president has done as well. And so we got messages the next day or so saying, you know, call them and write letters and things. And so I did send again a memo to the president that said, in effect, that it is now time to go public with the hostility and deal with the hostility and power of these networks. 2/3 of the American people were getting their primary source of information about the nation and about the world was 3 networks where you had about 12 men in New York and Washington deciding what people saw and heard about their country and what they should think, basically, in a lot of ways, about their president. So I told the president that we had to take him on, and I would be delighted to write a speech for Vice President Agnew, and we had a plan, and we sent it over to Bob Haldeman. He took it into the president, and there's a photograph of the memo back. It's got Bob Haldeman's writing on it. P has seen. Go ahead. That means the president has seen. Go ahead, get the vice president, write the speech for him. We'll deliver it, you know, in a couple of days, which is what we did. And the vice president went out to Des Moines, Iowa, and delivered a speech on the 13th, and the speech was one of the greatest successes, certainly in the career of Vice President Agnew, who had been really ridiculed for a great part of that time. And I can still remember it when, after I finished the speech, I was called over by the President of the United States to the Oval Office, and he was doing some editing on my work. And I was a little concerned about this because I thought the speech was a poetic masterpiece. And he had his coat and tie on, and he had his glasses on, his reading glasses, and he had a pen out, and he would write words in, one of them that, these guys are licensed by government, and I was jolted by that. And then as he read on, he said quietly and sort of a murmur, "This'll tear the scab off those expletive deleteds." And I broke out laughing, and he did too, because we knew that this was going to really set the country on fire, the first president ever to take on national press and national networks. And I'll tell you, then, when I was done the speech and sent the final draft up to the vice president with 2 changes, and the only 2 changes came from the president because I wouldn't have sent any others up there. And I remember I got word, because we'd had put something in the speech that really bugged them, to say whether people hear what I say tonight depends on them, not us. ABC decided to go live with the speech. And then I went up to the University Club a little nervous, swimming in the pool. Sally Brinkerhoff called me and said, CBS and NBC are going live with this speech. So that this is either going to be a great speech or this is the end of my political career. And Agnew's speech was almost as much of a sensation as was President of the United States Richard Nixon's. And Agnew gave the next week another speech, which I helped him with, attacking the Post and the Times. And so what had happened, President of the United States in his first year had tried to reach out and work with the Democrats. People who tell you he didn't aren't telling you the truth. Ray Price worked on that inaugural of his, and it was conciliatory. But what happened is they were going to break Nixon as they had broken Lyndon Johnson. But at the end of that year, 1969, that divisive year in America, Richard Nixon, if you can believe it, was at 68% approval in the Gallup poll and 19% disapproval. Astonishing. And here was Nixon 7 years before, had been written off as the biggest loser in American politics. Astonishing. Let me move forward now. Could I, Larry, you got that water up here, right there? Thanks. Thank you. Larry's always done this fine work. Thank you. I need a little more energy also in there, Larry. Let me advance now to another event, and that was April 28th, 1970. I got a call. I was in my office in the executive office building looking out on 17th Street, and I got a call. It was the President of the United States. He said, come on down to my EOB office. So I did. So I came into his office, and he said quickly, we're going into Cambodia. We're sending American forces into Cambodia. We're going to clean out the fishhook and the parrot's beak, both of them. One of them was the Cosvin headquarters for Vietnam of the communists. The other was the closest area to Saigon, where the North Vietnamese would remain. They would strike into South Vietnam, then retreat to sanctuaries. They had 8 of them. Nixon says we're going into every one of them. And he said we've already started bombing. And I was taken aback because I said, sir, if you've started bombing, they know we're coming. And that's where I learned the secret of the administration. He said, we've been bombing those guys for a long, long time. And this was the famous, the bombing of Cambodia, for which allegedly later they're going to try to impeach Richard Nixon, but they dared not do so. So Nixon gave me a draft from the National Security Council that he didn't like. He said there's some good paragraphs in here, but it's blah, it's dry, and we need something else. So he dictated paragraph after paragraph to me, and I wrote them down on those famous yellow pads. And he says, give them back and get this back to me in 3 hours, and don't tell anyone, and don't give the speech to anyone. And so I said, well, I'm going to have to tell my secretary, because she's going to have to type the draft as I start writing them. He said, tell her, but no one else. I knew this would make a problem for the individual who was the national security advisor, Dr. Kissinger. So what I did is I worked up the draft, took it down to the president in about 3 hours when I was done with it, then headed up to the university club, where we all swam. It was an all-men's club, so we swam without bathing suits, and I'm swimming up and down the pool. And somebody comes in and said, Mr. Buchanan, you've got a phone call from the White House. And I go to the phone and pick it up, and it's a Germanic voice of our foreign policy advisor, Henry Kissinger. Where is the speech? So Henry and I were going back and forth, fighting over this, and Nixon, the president, did his final draft himself. And the speech was explosive for the reason that most of the country assumed we're just continuing to move out of Vietnam. And he was going to clean out the sanctuaries, basically, so the American troops in Vietnam would be secure while we're withdrawn, and also to reduce the casualties. But the country sort of exploded. And added to it, the president went over to the Pentagon to get the report the next day on how well the troops were doing. And when he came out, it was a woman, her son or her husband was in Vietnam, and she said, thank you. And so President Nixon said, those guys, my son or my husband's over there. So the president said, those kids over there, those men over there are outstanding, they're terrific, and then you take these bums blowing up campuses. And he came back to the White House. So the bums comments started to rise. And 2 days later, on Kent State, the National Guard shot 4 students at Kent State and wounded 9. And the full story was that in Kent, Ohio, that crowds in the city of Kent or the town of Kent had burned down much of the main street. The governor had come in, they'd called out the National Guard, then they'd burn the ROTC building Monday or Sunday night on the campus. And then on Monday, the crowds got out there, and the National Guard were backing up a hill, and pieces of concrete and rocks and things were thrown at them. But there were 4 dead in Ohio, as the song goes, and 9 wounded. So this was campuses exploded. Richard Nixon was blamed. He was saying he called them bums, and then people shot the bums. It was really awful for the president, and he had a press conference that Friday night. And then the Saturday morning, he had that famous visit to the Lincoln Memorial, where he took Manolo. He got up in the middle of the night and went over there and took Manolo up to the Capitol and over to the Mayflower for breakfast. And then 2 days later, students at Jackson State were shot, African-American students who had nothing to do with the riots that had gone on in the street, but the police had fired at them. So Richard, I saw him in those days, and I think that was the Gethsemane, if you will, of President Nixon before the Watergate broke on him. I've never seen him so down, and I've got in my book, I've got memos from Pat Moynihan. The White House staff was divided, the country was divided, and I've never seen the president have it so tough. And how he got through it alone is remarkable, a tribute to the man, a remarkable tribute, because there were a lot of people who were even inside the White House who let the president know that they thought he had not done the right thing. Let me move from there to the politics. What Ken talked about, adumbrated briefly, the political grand strategy of the Nixon administration, why I think he ranks right up there as a success politically in the 20th century with FDR, who created that New Deal majority that got 5 straight presidential elections, and Nixon ranks up there. Let's go back in 1962, after Nixon lost to Jack Kennedy, then got beat by Pat Brown badly during the time of the missile crisis. Howard K. Smith of ABC ran a documentary on the next weekend, the political obituary of Richard Nixon, and invited in Alger Hiss to testify on TV to what a failure Mr. Nixon was and what a loser Mr. Nixon was, and he was at the bottom of his career. By 1972, Richard Nixon was back and had won the greatest landslide in American political history. Now, how did he do that in terms of political strategy? Basically, when I went to work for Nixon in 1965, I argued that I know all about the Pact of Fifth Avenue with Nelson Rockefeller in 1960, where Nixon tried to bring together the Nixon Republicans and Rockefeller Republicans, who would have been strong enough, I think, together to beat John F. Kennedy. And Rockefeller, of course, behaved badly, and the president didn't take him as VP or didn't get him as VP. And I told him by 65, because I had been a Goldwaterite, I said, the center of gravity of this party has shifted. I said, we just seen a bunch of outsider conservatives, student types, and the Joe Shell types in California have taken over the Republican Party nationally. At the same time, you are Mr. Republican. You have the center of the Republican Party locked up. If you can marry these conservatives to the center of the party, forget about the Rockefeller wing, they're not going to beat anybody anymore, that you got to get these two together, you've got the nomination. This basically was the strategy Nixon took, Nixon, very much more able, did not read the liberals out of the party, but he did put together this coalition to keep Reagan from coming in against him successfully, and that won him the Republican nomination. But when we got into the White House, the question was, recall I said it was 43 all. We were tied up at the end of the race with Humphrey coming back. And so we needed a strategy to build a majority. And so you've heard an awful lot about the Southern strategy, and there's no doubt there was a Southern strategy, but there was also a Northern Catholic strategy. I mean, I grew up Catholic in Northwest DC, and you could call it a ghetto, but basically it was a community. And they loved Harry Truman, and they weren't much for Dewey and people like that, but they liked Nixon. Nixon was an anti-communist, he was a middle American. He had a lot of things going for him that they didn't have the hostility to Nixon you found in the New York elites who despised the old man. So I said, the thing we have, if we can do, there's two huge blocks of the Democrats whom we can get on a variety of issues. One is the Northern Catholics, folks like the people I grew up with. And the others, obviously, is the Southern Protestants. Now, you've got Mr. Nixon had a solid position all along. He supported every civil rights bill. We didn't change our position on civil rights. We hit some new issues. It was a time of riot and anarchy, so we were going to be the law and order party. We're going to back up the cops, and we did that. It was a time, the counterculture, all the revolution, sex, drugs, rock and roll, all this other stuff, or post-rock and roll. And so Nixon was the traditional culture, and he stood up for it. We had Dizzy Gillespie in the White House. That was not Woodstock, but Woodstock they had that summer. So we did that, the traditional culture versus the counterculture. And then you had supporting the troops in Vietnam. Most of the working class, middle class folks, they're the ones who had their sons over there. So Nixon stood behind the troops in Vietnam for peace with honor in Vietnam and against the demonstrators and against the radicals, against the guys who in that new moratorium in 1969, who had spun off from the crowd on the Monument lot and gone over and tried to assault the Department of Justice. They raised the Viet Cong flag in place of the Old Glory right there on Constitution Avenue. And John Mitchell, I remember, was on the 5th floor looking out, and he told his wife, Martha, it looked like the Russian Revolution down there. So we stood with those folks unabashedly, and on the issues of elitism, Mr. Nixon stood with populism, not a harsh populism, but he was with the average guy, he was with the middle Americans, he's with the forgotten Americans, he's with the silent majority. All these folks, which were then the broad majority, and silent majority was exactly right, we stood with them, and all these folks started moving out of the Democratic Party or away from the Democratic elites like Teddy Kennedy and McGovern and the rest of them, and a number of Democrats. I've got a piece in there about Scammon and Wattenberg, wrote a book in 1970, The Real Majority. They said, Democrats better wake up. He said, because these folks they like Agnew and they like Nixon, and they like the views they've got, and they don't like all this radicalism. So the country was basically, we were redividing the country differently, but Richard Nixon and the Republican Party, amazingly, were winding up with a larger half, which was astonishing when you consider that in '64, when Goldwater lost, we had less than 1/3 of the House and the Senate, less than 1/3 of the governors. The Republican Party was flat on its back. Richard Nixon had rebuilt it in '66, and now he was proceeding to make it the center core of a vast new majority, which would do what? Win 4 of 5 presidential elections in coming years, and all 4 of those would be by 40 state majorities with 149 state majority. That's the grand strategy that Nixon had. And then we got to get into where Ken and I must say, we did some opposition work on a fellow named Edmund Muskie. After 1970 was over, it was January 20th, 1971, Nixon sent a memo to me wanting to know why we weren't hammering Muskie harder. That's one thing which we both agreed on. The most dangerous adversary Nixon could face in 1972 was Ed Muskie. He'd gotten tremendous press as VP candidate in 1968, 1970, when we ran a pretty raw campaign. He had given a nationwide speech which condemned Nixon and Agnew for McCarthyism and all the rest. And the press liked him, and his positions were ideally suited. He was a moderate liberal. He was a Catholic, a real threat to our Catholic strategy. So I wrote a memo to the president that said, in very strong terms, saying we're going to have to go after him. We're going to have to take this fellow down. He's the main one. And Teddy Kennedy can't beat us, Humphrey can't beat us, and Scoop Jackson can't beat us. I said we ought to go down to the kennels and turn all the dogs loose on ecology ed. 3 years later, I was explaining that memorandum before the Watergate Committee. But President Nixon was constantly prodding us. Even Billy Graham was telling Mr. Nixon, sir, you know that Muskie's very strong in the South, and the president would send a memo up, what are you doing, Buchanan? I thought you were supposed to handle this. And so we had a little interlude there, and I have to tell you a story, and it ended it was the Pentagon Papers. It was the day after Trisha got married in the Rose Garden that next Sunday. New York Times, full of memos from the Department of Defense, secret, classified, put all together. They weren't from the Nixon administration, from the Kennedy-Johnson administrations. And they were clearly designed to damage the war effort, clearly designed to point out that we were lied into war. And the New York Times had supported the war, and they turned against it as the Post and the rest of them had. But Henry Kissinger was outraged by it, and the president was outraged by it. And they turned out to be a fellow, I guess it was Daniel Ellsberg. The name surfaced very soon, very quickly. So Mr. Nixon, and I don't think it was a wise idea, pushed Ehrlichman and Bob Haldeman and Colson to get an investigation going of Ellsberg and run it right out of the White House, because Hoover, Ellsberg's father-in-law, or his former father-in-law, apparently was very close to Hoover. And Hoover wasn't doing it, so they said, the president wants you to do it, Buchanan, the investigation. And I said, well, I'm not Elliot Ness. I don't know how to investigate anything. And so they kept pushing me to head it up and get together a team. So I said, I will go over and talk to these investigators and people they'd gotten together from various departments, justice and elsewhere, and who knows where. But I went into this meeting with these characters. They had sideburns and they had guns, and none of them had jackets on or anything. And I'm supposed to head up this group. And so, as I understood it, we're not only to tie Ellsberg to everything that was done, which wasn't going to be difficult, the FBI is doing that, but dig up anything on Ellsberg's background which would discredit these people. So one of these guys gets up and says, Buchanan, I'm not sure of this, but we got reports that he may have been engaged in orgies. And I said, orgies? He said, yeah. I said, well, look, Ellsberg's at about 5% in the polls. You guys let that out and he'll shoot right up to 15%. And these guys, all the cowboys started laughing. I went back to the White House and I said, I am not doing this job. I'm not doing this job. Regrettably, my good friend Bud Crow took it over. Otherwise, I would have been in charge of Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt. So, but anyhow, then the Muskie thing, I will say, is an adversary strategy with opposition research. And again, Ken and I were in on this, working together. It was as effective as anything I have seen against Muskie, you know. And Muskie got going and was doing extremely well, and he looked like the nominee. And then up in New Hampshire, somebody sent. We didn't, to my knowledge, we didn't do it. To this day, C-SPAN has listened. We didn't write the Canuck letter, but this letter arrived where Muskie had laughed at an insult to Canucks, who of course are French Canadians, many of whom I found out later living up in New Hampshire, who were not amused by this. And my friend Bill Loeb, the publisher, he published this and denounced Muskie. So Muskie shows up in front of the Union leader and breaks down in tears in front of the Union leader, and this is all filmed. And so what happened after that is Muskie won New Hampshire by about 10 points over McGovern, but it was a small amount considering Muskie came from next door. And so then he goes down to Florida, and Muskie is wiped out by George Wallace, who swept every county in the state of Florida on the anti-busing issue and wiped up the floor with 6 liberal Democrats, including Muskie, who ran fourth. So Muskie was pretty much out of the race. And, you know, Ken and I had written, and I just put it into my notes here, when I wrote Nixon a memo after I did an analysis for him of Muskie, Humphrey, Kennedy, and Scoop Jackson. Long analyses, took thousands of words, just studied and researched all the press clippings and everything we had from the RNC and the news summaries. And I had it done, and then I wrote the president this note. I said, Muskie, Kennedy, Jackson, Humphrey are the only credible ones we see as Democratic candidates, as no president is so virtuous as to be granted George McGovern to run against. And we had gotten in June of by 1972, we had gotten George McGovern. Let me move now to the Watergate thing and Watergate events, the break-in of June 17th. And let me deal with it this way. The whole thing of Watergate lasted 22 months from the break-in to the president's resignation. And again, I got a call from Ken on June 17th after they had broken in, saying 5 people broke into the Watergate headquarters of the DNC, and I knew instantly it was probably our folks, almost surely from the committee to re-elect. So that proceeded, and it was not too huge until the spring of 1973, and then that was the time we decapitated the entire White House staff, the president did. And then we went through and the tapes were revealed and the Watergate hearings, and I testified for 5 hours before the Irvin Committee because of a pack of lies released that we had run some dirty trick strategy, which we had not. And it came to October, and one reason I want to mention this is because it was brought up in the firing of James Comey. I told folks I did not arrange to have the firing of James Comey, have the president announce it the day my book was published with a chapter on the Saturday Night Massacre. But I have been belabored about this. So let me tell you again, to put this into some perspective of where the president was. It's October. I just testified to the Watergate Committee, so Shelley and I were down in Key Biscayne. The president said, come on down and take a couple of days off. And we were down there, and on October 6th, the Egyptian army crossed the Suez Canal in a surprise attack. They moved anti-aircraft guns to the canal. They shot the American F-4s out of the sky, killed 1,000 Israeli troops. They were punching through in the Sinai Peninsula, and they were breaking through, and Moshe Dayan, who was the defense minister, caught by surprise because it was a Jewish high holy days, He said, he was said to be preparing to fix nuclear weapons on his aircraft, and he said this may be the end of the Third Temple. So you had this war started in the Middle East and going. Then you had the vice president resign on October 10th. And then you had the great argument in the White House over who should replace him. And then we had worked out a deal with the special prosecutor, or we thought we had, worked out a deal to turn over the subpoenaed tapes to the special prosecutor. And here's what the deal was. We would provide summaries of all the Watergate materials in the tapes, but not the tapes themselves. Senator Stennis, Democrat from Mississippi, would validate they were complete and accurate regarding Watergate. And that then they would be provided to the Watergate Committee, they'd be provided to Judge Sirica, be provided to the prosecutors. Elliot Richardson, I was told, was aboard with the deal. Howard Baker was aboard. Senator Ervin was aboard. Everybody was aboard. And so we weren't sure Archibald Cox, the special prosecutor, was aboard. But my understanding was that Richardson had said that if Cox refuses to accept the deal, he will not be allowed to subpoena any more tapes. And if he balks, I will tell him that is it. And if he refuses and goes after more tapes, then I will exercise my duty that he's gone beyond the bounds, and I will remove him myself. So we were all set. And so I called, Al called me, and he said, here's the deal, where we're going. It was Thursday or Friday night. I said, is Elliot aboard? He said, yes. So then we find out he's not aboard, and so I sent a memo over to the president, and he said, come on over to the Oval Office, and this is around 3:30 on Saturday. And he went into the office, and he very calmly explained, he said, I've got Henry Kissinger in Moscow. The Russians reportedly have been putting nuclear weapons in ships that are moving toward the Bosphorus and Dardanelles. Their airborne divisions are moving toward airfields. And we've got American forces on heightened alert. I cannot have my Attorney General successfully defy me when we've got Brezhnev over there watching my reaction to what's going on. I've got no choice but to do it. And to this day, I think the president had no choice. I think he did the right thing. Maybe they're going to call me back to another committee here. So, but that's the circumstances of this are all lost in what you see as though, the president just went over to just throw everybody out of the special prosecutor's office when they were doing such a nice, honorable, upright job. So let me now turn, we can't go, we want to get to some questions. Let me talk about what were really the achievements of Richard Nixon. And again, this library really has it done magnificently. Meg Greenfield, who was an editorial editor at the Washington Post, said, and no fan of the president, said, I think we belong to the Nixon generation. We've never known a time growing up when he was not an issue in the election, and we are likely in our lives never to know a time when he is not a matter of discussion. And I think that's right. Doug Schoen, I don't know if you had him out here. He's a Democratic, I guess they call him Democratic strategist, a very bright fellow, worked in their campaigns. He says Richard Nixon was the most consequential political figure of the second half of the 20th century. Bob Dole, in his famous eulogy, said ours was the age of Nixon. Consider, only two men in American history have been on 5 national tickets, Richard Nixon and FDR. Richard Nixon set the all-time record for being on the cover of Time magazine 55 times, from the Alger Hiss case, through the Senate races, through the vice presidency, through the wilderness years, through his own presidency, and beyond. In foreign policy, what did he achieve? He promised to bring all U.S. troops and POWs home from Vietnam, and he did. He negotiated the greatest strategic arms limitations agreement since the 1922 Washington Naval Agreement. He opened up China, which is communist China, which had been sealed for 25 years since the horrors of the Korean War. In the Six-Day War, not the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War I just described, he saved Israel. Golda Meir herself said, among American presidents, Richard Nixon is the best friend we ever had. He drew Egypt. Even at the end of his presidency, he brought Egypt back around out of the Soviet bloc into the Western camp. In domestic policy, he ended the draft. He enacted the 18-year-old vote. Some of these things, incidentally, I wasn't that much for. He created EPA, and I wasn't involved in that. I remember Earth Day and all of these issues. I do remember one comment as I was sitting in a meeting. Howard Baker was there, and the senator, we'd gone in for Baker in 1966 and helped elect him. And Senator Baker was there, and they were working on the Clean Air Act, I think. And I do remember a comment the senator made. He said, when we get finished with this thing, the only thing that's going to be able to move in America is a small pony. What else did he do? He created OSHA. He indexed Social Security to protect it against inflation. He elevated the National Cancer Institute and declared a war on cancer. He got 4 justices elevated to the Supreme Court, including 1 president, 1 future Chief Justice. He desegregated the Southern schools. Even Tom Wicker, a liberal Democrat and anti-Nixon columnist for the New York Times, wrote a book called One of Us about Nixon, where he believes it was his greatest achievement. He moved the nation also off the gold standard, ended Bretton Woods. A lot of these things are historic events. So politically, I think he was rivaled only by FDR, and he prepared the ground, frankly, for Ronald Reagan, who got another 49-state landslide 12 years later. And I've worked for Ronald Reagan, and one time he pulled me aside and said, I think Mr. Nixon had a pretty good foreign policy, despite what he had said about détente. So who was Richard Nixon? Well, as politically speaking, and again, let me tell you a story. Peregrine Worsthorne was a famous British correspondent and had been writing good things about President Nixon. And he wanted an interview, and he got to me, and I told Mr. Nixon he should do it. And so I was in the room with Oval Office when Worsthorne, and Nixon knew he was good. He said, the great British writers don't take notes. They just sit there and listen, and they memorize it, and they can walk out and they recreate it. So, I remember Worsthorne asked Nixon if he would have been a New Dealer if he had entered politics at the time of the New Deal, rather than when he did, the post-war era. And Nixon wrote him a long memo, which is in my book, of just how the way he grew up in Yorba Linda affected who he was. He was not against government action, but didn't believe that folks like him and should really rely on it. People should only use government that really needed it. So Nixon came to power in the post-war GOP, 1946. Anti-communism and the Cold War. These were the issues that initially, I think, made him and defined him from 46 with the Alger Hiss case, the battles against Helen Gahagan Douglas, the battles against Adlai Stevenson. But by 1968, he had clearly moved on. I do think he had moved on from an anti-communist, small c conservative to a much broader vision of the world. And I do think there was a touch of Woodrow Wilson in him. This idea that he could create a generation of peace. I thought myself that, we hadn't had one of those in world history, so it might be utopian. But he generally believed that. And so in domestic policy, I think the term for him is progressive or pragmatic Republican when it comes to issues like EPA. He was not averse to using government if he felt it could do good for the people. He was not averse to that. And a lot of the programs you'll see described here indicate that. He was not a libertarian, as Barry Goldwater, my first political hero, was. Nixon was also an internationalist, but not a globalist. I mean, you can go back to 1947 on the Herter Commission, where he's going off to Europe, and he and Jack Kennedy was like that in a way. They both supported the Marshall Plan. They both supported NATO. They both supported containment of the Soviet Union, unlike the old Taft conservatives. On politics, Richard Nixon, I think it's fair to say, in his strategies, political strategies and tactics, he was anti-elitist, partly populist, middle American, as I said, forgotten Americans, representing those who are unrepresented in his own way. And the combination of those three things, I think, were the things that gave him that mammoth landslide in 1972. Socially and culturally, he was a traditionalist. And there are idiosyncrasies about the old man. One story, I think it's in my book. I did the briefing books after Agnes Waldron, who did them for Nixon when he was vice president, and when I went to work for him in 65, 66, she had done the briefing books. And so Nixon pretty soon had me doing the briefing books for him up in New York. And then during the campaign of 68, then during all the presidency, he would go over to his office in the EOB, and I want my briefing book by such and such a date. And I would go through all the papers and get all the questions out that the press was asking. I'd go through Ziegler's briefings, get the questions they're asking. I'd call around the major departments. What are the reporters over there pushing the secretary on? Is there anything they're after? And give me a call, give me a heads up if they're after something. And after a while, it got so I could predict almost every question that was asked at the press conferences. And sometimes I actually predicted every single one. And after one of those press conferences, when Nixon, in 1973, I'd gotten every question, and it was obvious I'd predicted every one. And so he called, as he did after press conferences, and, well, Buchanan, you did your usual excellent job. I noticed that you predicted every question that the press asked. And I said, well, yes, sir. I believe we did, sir. Yes, sir. He said, well, there are other questions in the briefing book that were not asked. And I paused, and then he said, next time, leave those out. One other time, and it dates to one of my various runs for the presidency in 1992, I decided to take a leave from Crossfire and run against the President of the United States 10 weeks before the New Hampshire primary. And so my sister and I put together a little organization. We went up to New Hampshire, and Nixon was, I think President Bush was about at 70%, and I was about at 15%, and I think David Duke was at 5%. So I went up there and really worked and campaigned, and we did well, and sure enough, we cut it down to where President Bush beat me, but it was only 51 to 37. So we'd done that in 10 weeks. And so I went to Georgia, and we did as well. But then came Super Tuesday, and there were 8 primaries, and I was wiped out in all 8. So we were sort of feeling down, and so I called up President Nixon, and he came on the line. I said, Mr. President, 10 for 10, not bad, eh? And Nixon said, Buchanan, you're the only extremist I know with a sense of humor. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Pat has agreed to answer some of your questions, but before he does, I just wanted to plug the book. They are available for order in the museum store and down the colonnade. Our first question.
Hi, Mr. Buchanan. The first 4 months of our, over here, on your right.
On the right over here? Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I can't stop thinking during the first 4 months of our current president's administration about Nixon's final speech the morning that he resigned, when he said things like, those that hate you don't win unless you hate them, and then you destroy yourself. And also he said, never be petty. And he was telling people like Monica Crowley at the end of his life, he probably told you, he was asking rhetorically, why the hell did I go through the fire if others were not going to learn from my mistakes? And are you afraid that, the current president is doing things that are just going to hand the same sort of enemies the proverbial sword, so that, as Nixon said to Frost, they'll stick it in and twist it with relish.
I do think this. I think, President Trump has gotten the worst media I've seen of any candidate or president for the last, I'd say, 18 months of his campaign and first 4 months of his presidency. There's no question about it, and the mood in Washington, D.C., let me say this about all the things that have broken so far. In terms of substance, this is no Watergate. We don't even have a single crime yet that has been alleged against the president or his White House staff. And yet the mood and the hostility and the animosity on the TV and the cable TV and the rest of it are unlike anything I've seen. I think I was quoted in the press saying, I don't know how you sustain this kind of intensity and hostility. It's only been 4 months, and you got 44 to go in his first term. So I don't know how this is going to end, but I don't know that it's going to end well for the country. I do think the president is in some danger now of losing the critical margins that he's got in the houses, people moving away from him in the Congress, so that he's unable to do really what he wants to do. Now, I supported Donald Trump. One reason was, frankly, he came down and the issues I had raised, the border security, staying out of foreign wars that are none of America's business, new trade arrangements whereby we don't have a $400 billion trade deficit with the Chinese taking all these factories out of the country and all these jobs out of the... So he hit all these issues, and I supported him. And I do think he's got some real problem. And I do think, quite frankly, there is some blame attendant to how he's handled it. I mean, we didn't call the press names when we did it. We had a speech, major speech, 2 speeches, and then we'd move off it. I mean, President Nixon, there's no doubt he felt he was getting a terrible press at times, but he contained himself, and he was very disciplined. And I don't think self-discipline is not the first phrase that comes to mind when I think of the president. Yes, Ben.
We have a question in the back row.
Okay.
Hi, as a young individual, I'm very much concerned about the massive immigration, and I just want to make sure that what can we do to modify and repeal the 1965 immigration law that has drastically changed this country, has had a huge impact in California, and what's your thoughts about Wall Street?
I worked in Mr. Nixon's office at the corner of Wall and Broad for 3 years. On the 1965 Act, I will say I was an editorial writer in St. Louis, and I don't recollect even taking a position on it, and I don't, if you read Lyndon Johnson's memoirs, that act was enacted. I don't even think he mentions it in his memoirs. I looked it up one time and couldn't find it in his memoirs. I agree with you. This is one of the issues I ran on in 1990, which was I called for a moratorium on all immigration, cut the numbers down to a certain level, and so we could assimilate and Americanize and acclimate everyone who had come, many millions. Over those years, the way the folks that came from Eastern and Southern Europe came in the 1890s to 1920, and then you had a period of low immigration, so that by the time you got up to 1960, 97% of us all spoke English, and we all had the same culture, traditions, histories, holidays. And but to your point, I don't know that you could get that through, if you talk about repeal of the 65 Act, I don't know that you could get that through the Congress of the United States right now. I don't know that all the Republicans would go with it. I don't know that, I'm not sure President Trump would go with it. But I understand that. I do believe immigration, and I read and write a great deal about Europe. I mean, immigration is the great problem, I think, of Western civilization.
Could you tell us a little bit about what, to your recollection, Mr. Nixon thought about George Wallace and how much he was inspired by Wallace's success in getting white working class Democrats to vote for him?
You're talking about Governor Wallace. Well, when we were with Nixon, Wallace had in 1964 had come out of Alabama and torn up the Democratic primaries. He did tremendously well in Wisconsin and then Indiana and Maryland. I think he won a majority of the white vote in Maryland coming out as a governor, and he started off as basically it was anti the civil rights laws and the things were being imposed on the South. And Wallace then in '68, of course, he ran as a Democrat, which meant he wasn't going to run as a third party candidate in '68. So, but Wallace's appeal, there was no doubt about it, he had an enormous appeal that Nixon recognized, and it was populist. And the longer Wallace was around from 1964, 66, 68, the more he added to his repertoire. I mean, he was talking about, when you have the audiences, he'd say, I know some four-letter words too, W-O-R-K and S-O-A-P, And so Wallace was really starting to move people along those lines, and there's no doubt that the votes Wallace got were the votes we wanted to get. But Nixon had a position on civil rights he wasn't going to abandon, so what was best for us was to get Wallace out of the race or have him lose the Democratic nomination. But in Ben, in '68, Governor Wallace was shot right out there in Laurel, Maryland. 72, I'm sorry, was shot in '72. He was leading the Democratic Party in votes in all the primaries, and he won Michigan and Maryland the next day. So Wallace was a powerful force, but I think my own view was that Wallace could not win a Democratic nomination, and he could not win a general election. And if he got into a general election, as he did in '68, basically he siphoned off votes that would otherwise go to Nixon. I did look after the '72 election. Wallace, at one precinct where Wallace had gotten 173 votes, Nixon got 172 of them. In other words, they didn't go to George McGovern, they came to us. So this was the whole idea of the Southern Protestant strategy and the Northern Catholics, bringing them both. But you needed to get Wallace not to run. To do that as a third-party candidate, but as rising any higher, he couldn't do it. But in a way, Nixon couldn't compete with him. He couldn't compete with him. We used it in '68. We sent Spiro Agnew down to the Upper South. I went down there with him because he competed very well, in getting those votes with, and frankly, there's a quote in my book from Frank Gannon, got it from Mr. Nixon, where Lyndon Johnson told Mr. Nixon on the ride up to the inaugural that where everybody was praising Muskie, what a wonderful job he had done as vice president. And Johnson didn't think anything of Muskie. But he thought Agnew had really done a whale of a job and had won states like, helped us in North Carolina, Tennessee, or I guess, North Carolina, Tennessee, and states like that. Mm-hmm.
We have a question in the center.
Hello, sir, right here.
Which way? Okay.
You speak a lot about what President Nixon inherited in Vietnam. Next Monday is Memorial Day, and I actually lost my dad in Vietnam. Looking back in hindsight, are there a couple of things that President Kennedy, President Johnson, or President Nixon might have done to either change the outcome of the war or speed up the country's
withdrawal,
departure from Vietnam?
Obviously, since my brother was over there, and since I was supporting the war from the very beginning, from the time I was in journalism school when Jack Kennedy put the 16,000, the Green Berets went in. My view, and George Wallace in '68 wasn't all wrong when he said his slogan was win or get out. It wasn't all wrong. I think the United States of America, which had reduced the Japanese empire to rubble, greatest empire Asia had seen in 4 years, could have won that war. But I think what happened was the American establishment was broken on Vietnam. It lost the will. It would not take the measures necessary to win the war. And therefore, when President Nixon came in '69, he had decided we have to get out, and the consequences, he had to know the consequences could be bad. You know, my view was, and President Nixon, I will say this, talked to me, I talked to him after he left office. He says he should have done in '69 what he did in '72, which was mine the harbor at Haiphong and bomb Hanoi and unleash full power of the United States to win the war or to break the North Vietnamese. And I don't know why he didn't do that. And I don't know why. Of course, Jack, I don't think you can blame President Kennedy. He did put 16,000 in. But I think Lyndon Johnson raised that up to 500,000 troops. Incidentally, the new National Security Advisor, McMaster, I just read yesterday his book. He wrote a book, I think, about 20 years ago, in which he really blames the President Johnson, McNamara, and the others as really having behaved dishonorably during that war and not realizing what the outcome was going to be. So, I mean, that's something, I would almost, if you had a microphone, I'd like to, if you were over there, like to hear your view, because my brother came back with a lot of people's views about what was going on.
We have time for one question.
Go ahead.
Just as a reminder.
Just, what's your comment? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. I will say the Cambodian thing was a success. I mean, from the standpoint of it cost a lot of people, but the American casualties straight down from Cambodia at Kent State all the way to the end of the war. I remember when we came in, they were losing guys at 200 to 300 a week. Yes.
Yes, we have time for one more question. I just want to remind everyone that Nixon's White House Wars are available for purchase in the Colonnade and in the bookstore, and Pat will sign your books for you. Our final question.
It's an honor to ask you this question, Pat. You've been my political idol since I was a kid. My question to you, sir, is how do we go about bringing younger millennials to our cause? Thank you.
You know, that's, as they say on TV, that's a great question, which means I need time to think of it. It is hard to say because, I've written a number of books. I really think the 60s was a time when, a significant slice, small but articulate slice of the country, basically threw over the ideas that had animated the country and its growth, and all through all the generations previous to that, on culture, on morality, on issues of race, on various things like that. And that ideology, if you will, that ideology has spread and deepened to the point where, where we could win 49 states in 84, 72. We can't do that anymore. The country is so changed, and the academic community is so changed, and the school systems are so changed, and the values are so changed, that it is very tough. When you say winning over to our side, you mean winning over to the Republican Party. Republican Party is doing okay at the state and local level, exceedingly well. But I'm a believer that and I'm a bit of a pessimist if you've read any of my books. I am a believer that things that have changed are not going back again. And that if you're talking politically, what they call the blue wall, those 18 states and the District of Columbia that before 2016 went Democratic in all the previous 6 elections, that is growing. Demographically, it is very difficult for me to see how the Republican Party at the national level has any great longevity, and especially with the gentleman's question of continued mass immigration, which mostly comes now from third world folks who depend heavily upon government, who don't understand many ideas of Republicans about smaller government, less government programs. I remember when I was running in 1992, I was in a gym working out, and this fellow was an Hispanic American. He said, "What are you going to do for education, Well, I said, education by and large is a local state responsibility, and the federal government only spends about 6 or 7 cents of every education dollar, so you really need to focus on state and local." He said, "What are you going to do for education?" because that's what I care about. He wants the federal government to do it. And I think Republicans have a very difficult time reaching these folks. There's no question about it. Television broadcasting? Yeah, Fox has got some problems these days, though. Well, I mean, look, I went to journalism school in 1962, and there's Columbia University, top journalism school in the country, 65 Americans, 15 foreign folks. I was the only Goldwater individual in the school. I knew which way the media were going. You know, they were the guys that were my contemporaries and friends. And there weren't any Goldwater folks there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pat. Pat will be available in the lobby to sign your books. Thank you so much for coming.